The barren landscape stretched endlessly before Ethan Cross. The planet, once a thriving world, was now nothing more than a desolate wasteland. The air was thick with dust storms, swirling clouds of dirt that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind howled like a mournful cry, carrying with it the haunting echoes of long-lost civilizations. Ethan squinted into the distance, his eyes shielding from the stinging winds. His starship, an old and battered vessel, had crashed here days ago after a freak malfunction. Now he had no choice but to scavenge this hostile planet for parts to get back to his mission. Ethan wasn't just a scavenger. He was a war veteran, someone who had seen too much of the galaxy's darkness. The war, the destruction, the loss, it had all taken a toll on him. His past haunted him like the storm that relentlessly battered the planet. The crash had been his second chance, but even here, he couldn't escape the ghosts that lingered in the back of his mind. With every step, his boots crunched over the dry, cracked earth beneath him. His eyes scanned the wreckage of his ship scattered across the dusty plain. His ship was beyond repair, but there were always parts, small pieces of technology that could be useful. That's all Ethan needed right now, a way out. His fingers grazed over the remains of a broken engine when suddenly, a strange signal broke through the static of his communication device. It was weak but unmistakable. A distress signal. Curiosity sparked within him. A distress signal on a planet as desolate as this. It didn't make sense. He had been here for days, and there were no signs of life. At least, none that were human. He tapped the device, trying to hone in on the source of the transmission. The signal was coming from a few miles away, deep in the planet's wilderness. Ethan knew it was risky, but he had no other leads. Maybe this was his chance to find something useful. He made his way towards the source of the signal, the dust storm blocking his view of what lay ahead. His breath came out in shallow gasps, the air dry and unrelenting. The further he walked, the more oppressive the planet seemed, as if it was trying to swallow him whole. His military instincts kicked in as he scanned the horizon, his hand never leaving the pulse rifle slung across his back. Every creak and groan of the wind sounded like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. After what felt like hours of trudging through the storm, Ethan finally arrived at the coordinates. There, half buried in the sand, was an old alien ship. The metal was corroded and covered in dirt, but it still looked intact. He approached cautiously, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just any ship. It had markings of an alien race he didn't recognize. No human ship would be out here. What kind of creature would send a distress signal from this wasteland? He moved to the side, searching for an entry point. The hull was cracked, but there was a small opening at the rear, just big enough for him to crawl through. As he squeezed inside, the scent of decay hit him. Stale air, mixed with something faintly metallic. The ship's interior was dimly lit by flickering lights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the ship's cold metal floor. He moved deeper into the ship, his rifle at the ready, scanning for any signs of life. Then he heard it. A faint noise, like a soft groan. It was coming from the next compartment. He paused, his senses on high alert. The storm outside raged louder now, making it harder to hear. But that sound, there was something alive on this ship. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan approached the source of the noise. His boots made no sound as he crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He rounded a corner, and then he saw her. A girl. An alien girl, curled up in a corner, her body limp and covered in bruises. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. Her clothes were ragged, torn, and stained. She was barely alive. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had seen suffering before, but nothing like this. Her species was unlike any he had ever encountered. Her skin was a pale shade of green, almost translucent, with faint veins running across her arms and face. She had sharp, angular features, and long silver hair that lay tangled around her head. She was small, frail, and alone. "Hey," Ethan muttered under his breath, crouching beside her. He reached out cautiously, touching her arm. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. Ethan's mind raced. He had no idea who or what she was, but one thing was clear: she needed help. He had been a soldier. He had fought battles, seen the worst of the galaxy, but this felt different. She wasn't just a casualty of war. She was something else, something that didn't belong here, abandoned and left to die. "Come on, kid," he muttered, gently shaking her. "You're not alone." Her eyes flickered open, though they were clouded with pain and confusion. She looked up at him, and for a moment, their gazes locked. It wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was something more, something Ethan couldn't quite place. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Help me," she said, her voice raspy, barely audible over the storm outside. Ethan's mind raced. There was no time to figure out who she was, or where she came from. He had to get her out of here. But just as he was about to lift her, a soft beeping noise sounded from his device. He froze. The signal that had led him here was still active, but now it was more than just a distress signal. It was a tracker. Someone, or something, was tracking them. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had been so focused on saving the girl that he hadn't noticed the danger lurking nearby. He quickly scanned the ship's exterior through his device. Multiple signals, all heading straight for him. Alien trackers, a whole team of them, moving fast. "Great," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Just what I needed." The storm outside had shielded him from their detection, but now that he was inside the ship, they had locked onto his location. There was no time to waste. Ethan knew that if they stayed here any longer, they wouldn't make it out alive. He grabbed the girl, hoisting her up with surprising strength. She winced, but didn't protest. Ethan quickly made his way back toward the entrance, his mind racing for a plan. He couldn't fight off an entire team of trackers, not without backup, not on this planet. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He had survived worse. Just as he reached the ship's exit, the ground shook beneath him. A loud crash echoed from the distance. They were close, too close. With no other choice, Ethan sprinted toward the wreckage of his starship, Lyra in his arms. The trackers were almost upon them, their footsteps pounding behind him. He could hear the sound of their heavy boots, the whir of cloaking devices, and the faint hiss of their weapons charging up. This was it, the moment where his survival instincts would be tested to the limit. He had to get to the ship and take off before they were caught. The stakes were higher than ever. Will Ethan make it in time? Can he save Lyra and escape the alien trackers closing in on them? The suspense built as Ethan's heart raced, knowing that every second counted. Ethan had no time to think. The trackers were closing in. Their heavy boots could be heard pounding on the ground, the hum of their cloaking devices making the air vibrate with an ominous energy. He held Lyra tightly, her frail form trembling in his arms. She was still barely conscious, her skin cool to the touch. But he had no choice. They couldn't stay in the ship any longer. The trackers were fast, and soon they would know every inch of the area around them. Ethan had to think quickly. The jungle ahead of him looked dark and dangerous. But it was their only chance. They had to outrun the bounty hunters. At least for now. The plan was simple. Get to the dense foliage, find a place to hide, and then figure out a way to fight back. But simple plans rarely worked in situations like this, especially when they were being hunted by beings who had technology far beyond anything humanity had ever seen. Ethan dashed forward, Lyra still in his arms. His breath was heavy, and his pulse raced with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The bounty hunters were using cloaking technology, and they were too close. If they saw him now, he would be dead before he could react. He pressed forward into the jungle, the thick underbrush making it harder to move quickly. Branches whipped at his face, and the ground was uneven, but he didn't slow down. Lyra's weight in his arms seemed to grow with every step, but he kept moving, pushing through the pain. The jungle was alive with sounds. The distant call of strange creatures, the rustling of leaves as the wind passed through, the snapping of twigs underfoot, all of it made it harder to hear the hunters. Ethan's military training kicked in. He slowed his pace, moving carefully, listening intently. He could feel the heat of the trackers on his skin, their presence so close it made his skin crawl. Every so often, he would catch a glimpse of their faint silhouettes through the trees, but they never showed themselves fully. The cloaking devices made them nearly invisible, but Ethan knew they were there. Lyra stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Ethan tried to give her a reassuring look, but there was no time for words. He had to keep moving. But then, something unexpected happened. Through the haze of panic and confusion, Lyra's voice reached his mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but inside his head, like a whisper from the deepest part of his consciousness. "Don't be afraid. I can help." Ethan stumbled slightly, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced down at her, but she was still looking around, her expression strained with exhaustion. Had she just spoken to him? No, it wasn't her voice, not in the way humans communicated. It was something else, a telepathic message. Her words weren't just a comfort, they were a promise. Lyra had powers that Ethan hadn't even begun to understand. He didn't know what kind of alien she was, but he had a feeling that her abilities were far from ordinary. Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment, Ethan could see a flicker of something deep within them. It wasn't just fear, it was determination. She wasn't as helpless as she appeared. With a burst of sudden energy, Lyra's hand shot out, and Ethan felt a wave of warmth wash over him. It was like a ripple in the air, a subtle shift that only he could feel. And then, everything changed. The jungle seemed to pause, the sounds of the world around him fading into a muted silence. For a brief moment, Ethan couldn't even hear the hunters anymore. It was as if the very air had thickened, wrapped itself around them like an invisible barrier. He glanced around, confused, trying to figure out what was happening. Lyra's hand was still outstretched, her eyes closed as she concentrated. Ethan wasn't sure what she was doing, but whatever it was working. The bounty hunters' cloaking devices were rendered useless, or at least temporarily malfunctioned. Ethan could see them now, their faint outlines becoming visible in the distance, their movements jerky and unnatural. But it wasn't enough. Lyra was still too weak, her energy drained from using her powers. The jungle around them began to return to its usual chaotic state, and the cloaked figures of the bounty hunters began to solidify once more. Ethan could hear them shouting commands in a language he didn't understand, their footsteps drawing closer. "We have to move," Ethan muttered, his voice urgent. He looked down at Lyra. She was pale, her breathing shallow, but there was a fire in her eyes now. She nodded, more determined than before. They didn't have much time. The hunters were regrouping. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her along with him as they ran deeper into the jungle. His mind raced with options. He had no weapons strong enough to deal with a whole team of bounty hunters equipped with cloaking devices, drones, and advanced weaponry. But he had something they didn't: human ingenuity. He quickly scanned their surroundings, looking for anything that could be used to their advantage. A twisted vine caught his eye. It was thick and coiled tightly around the base of a massive tree. With a quick motion, he yanked it free, pulling the vine with him. He and Lyra reached a clearing, and Ethan didn't hesitate. He looped the vine around a low-hanging branch and quickly tied it to a rock, creating a makeshift trap. He glanced over at Lyra, his eyes filled with urgency. She understood immediately and backed away with him, her powers still faintly shimmering in the air. The sound of the bounty hunters grew louder. They were close, very close. Ethan took a deep breath and motioned for Lyra to stay low. He positioned himself behind a thick tree trunk, his pulse rifle in hand, ready to fight if necessary. But the hunters didn't know the trap he had set. They were getting closer, their cloaked figures slowly emerging from the underbrush. And then, just as they were about to step into the clearing, Ethan triggered the trap. The vine snapped taut, sending the rock flying into the air, crashing down into the path of the lead bounty hunter. The distraction was enough. The hunters were momentarily thrown off guard, and that was all Ethan needed. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her forward, sprinting toward the next patch of dense jungle. The hunters quickly regained their composure, but by the time they did, Ethan and Lyra were already too far ahead. The chase was on, but for now, they had won the first round. They didn't stop to rest. They couldn't. But as they ran, Ethan felt a new sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for her, the mysterious alien girl who had powers beyond his understanding. And with her, maybe, just maybe, they could escape this nightmare. But they weren't safe yet. The hunters would be back, and this was only the beginning. The jungle was quieter now, but the air still hummed with tension. Ethan could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They had escaped the bounty hunters, for now, but the silence felt ominous. He glanced over at Lyra, who was walking beside him. Her usual aura of mystery was more pronounced than ever. She was hiding something, something important, and Ethan could feel it. There was a secret, one she hadn't yet shared with him. Lyra had barely spoken since they'd left the clearing. Her eyes were distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Ethan knew she was still recovering, both physically and emotionally, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to her story than what he'd been told. He had to know more, for both their sakes. "Lyra," Ethan said quietly, his voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, but I need to know what happened to you. Who are you really?" Lyra stopped in her tracks, her expression unreadable. The forest around them was eerily still, as if the trees themselves were waiting for her answer. She didn't say anything for a long time, but when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm a Zerath," she said, the word foreign and heavy. "We're from a distant galaxy, one far beyond your reach." Ethan felt a pang of confusion. He had never heard of the Zerath before, but the tone in her voice told him that they were important, that they were something powerful. She continued, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. "The Zerath were once a proud people, rulers of an empire that spanned many worlds. But our empire wasn't built on honor. It was built on slavery and conquest. We conquered others, enslaved entire civilizations. We treated them like tools, like nothing." Ethan's brow furrowed. It wasn't what he had expected to hear. He had assumed that Lyra was just another alien from a distant planet, but what she was describing was far darker. It sounded like her people had been the ones causing destruction, not the victims. "But you're not like them," Ethan said carefully. "You rebelled against your own people." Lyra's eyes glistened, and for a moment, she looked almost lost. "I was different. From the moment I was born, I was destined to be part of their war machine. They genetically modified me, made me into something unnatural. A weapon. I was to be the perfect soldier, with the strength and abilities that no one else possessed. But they made a mistake." Ethan could hear the pain in her voice, the raw emotion that came with remembering her past. He felt a tug in his chest, a deep sympathy for the alien girl who had suffered so much, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. "When I was older, when I realized what they had done to me, I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't be a part of their cruelty. I rebelled. I fought back against them, against everything they had forced me to become. But they weren't merciful." Her voice faltered as she continued, the weight of the memory bearing down on her. "I was captured, tortured, and then abandoned, left to die on a desolate planet. They thought I was useless, a failed experiment." Ethan felt his heart twist with anger and sorrow. He had always thought of aliens as distant, unknowable beings, but Lyra's story made her feel real. human. Her pain was palpable, and it resonated deep within him. "They left you to die?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra nodded, her eyes dark with memories of the past. "Yes, I was alone, abandoned, but I survived. I had to. I didn't know if there were any others like me, any who had fought back, but I knew I couldn't give up." For a long moment, Ethan didn't know what to say. The weight of her story hung in the air, and he could feel the burden she carried. He could sense her pain, her fear, her loneliness. She had been through so much, and yet she still stood here fighting. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "No one should have to go through that." Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. It was clear that she didn't trust easily, but in that moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a softening of the hardness she had carried for so long. She had told him her story, and he had listened. For the first time, Ethan felt like they were truly connecting. But just as the silence stretched between them, Ethan's mind wandered to his own past. He had his own scars, his own ghosts to deal with. The pain of loss, the memories of his family, his planet, hadn't faded. He could still feel the fire of the alien invasion that had destroyed everything he had known. His world had been torn apart, his family lost in the chaos. There had been nothing left but the wreckage of his home. "I understand more than you know," Ethan said quietly, his voice distant. "I lost everything, too." Lyra turned to face him, her expression softening as she saw the pain in his eyes. "How?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, his mind flashing back to the destruction, the screams of the people he had failed to protect. The memories still haunted him, but he had learned to bury them deep. "My planet was attacked," he said, his voice low. "I was part of the military. We tried to fight back, but the aliens, they were too powerful. We lost. I lost my family in the invasion. My parents, my sister, they were all gone, and I couldn't do anything to save them." Lyra's expression shifted, and for a moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm and steady. Ethan didn't pull away. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange sense of peace, as if, for a brief moment, he wasn't alone in his grief. "You're not alone," Lyra said softly. "I understand the pain of losing everything, but we have a chance now. Together, we can make things right." Ethan nodded slowly, a small, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, maybe we can." But even as he said it, the reality of their situation loomed over them. They were still being hunted. The bounty hunters wouldn't stop, and Lyra's past, her powers, were something that could either save them or destroy them. He didn't know which yet. But in that moment, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, for justice, for redemption, for the chance to protect the people who still had hope. Lyra had given him that hope, and now it was his turn to protect her. The journey ahead would be long, and it would be hard. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt ready. With Lyra by his side, they could face whatever came next. Ethan could feel the ground tremble beneath his boots, the faint hum of the air vibrating in the atmosphere. His eyes scanned the horizon, the dense jungle stretching endlessly ahead, its dark trees obscured by the constant, eerie mist that clung to the planet's surface. The air was thick, charged with an ominous energy. It had only been a few hours since they'd escaped the bounty hunters, but now something much bigger was coming. The signal had been picked up. There was no hiding from the Galactic Empire, no running far enough to escape their relentless pursuit. Ethan could feel it in his bones. They were close. His hand instinctively tightened around the blaster at his side as he turned to Lyra, whose eyes were filled with determination. They both knew what was coming. The Empire was no ordinary enemy, and their soldiers were as lethal as they came. But Lyra wasn't just any ordinary alien. He had seen what she was capable of, the power she could unleash when cornered. "We need to move now," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "Get ready." Lyra nodded, her face set in determination, but Ethan could see the fear flickering in her eyes. It wasn't fear for herself. She had faced worse, but fear for him. She knew what was at stake, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing another ally, another person who had decided to trust her. The first explosion rocked the ground with such force that it sent both of them sprawling to the ground. Ethan barely had time to react. The roar of the blast echoed in his ears as the world around them turned into a haze of dust and smoke. The trees around them were splintering, their trunks torn apart by the sheer force of the explosion. The sound of whistling missiles cut through the air, and another explosion lit up the sky. They were under attack, and there was no escape. Ethan scrambled to his feet, the world spinning as he struggled to keep his bearings. His heart was pounding in his chest as the full scale of the attack became clear. The Empire had locked onto their position. There was no more running. It was time to fight. "Stay low," Ethan shouted, pulling Lyra to the ground with him as another round of blasts rained down from above. The explosions were deafening, each one sending waves of heat and destruction through the air. Ethan could feel the heat from the blasts, even from where they lay. He clenched his teeth, trying to steady his breathing as he scanned the area for any sign of an escape route. There was none. The jungle had become a war zone, the very earth beneath them turning into a battleground. Lyra's face was pale, her breath shallow as she looked up at him. She was terrified, but she wasn't frozen in fear. No, she was calculating, thinking, always looking for a way out. Her eyes flicked toward the sky, and in that moment, Ethan knew she was about to do something incredible. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Before Ethan could ask what she was planning, Lyra raised her hand, and a strange, invisible force began to ripple through the air. It was as if the very atmosphere itself had bent to her will. Ethan watched, wide-eyed, as a glowing shield materialized around them, a barrier of pure energy that shimmered and crackled with raw power. For a brief moment, the world outside their shield seemed to slow down. The explosions continued, but now they were merely distant echoes, harmless as they hit the force field. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he realized what Lyra had done. She had created a telekinetic shield, something he hadn't thought possible. "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan breathed, awestruck. "How?" "We don't have time to talk," Lyra snapped, her voice strained but firm. "We need to keep moving. They'll find a way to break through." Ethan nodded, though he could barely believe what he was seeing. He had seen many things in his time as a soldier, but nothing like this. Lyra wasn't just some injured alien. She was something far more powerful. The question was, why hadn't she shown him this side of her earlier? The shield flickered briefly, and Ethan's pulse quickened. The Empire's soldiers were closing in. The shield might keep the blasts at bay for a little while, but it wouldn't hold forever. They needed to escape, and fast. As if on cue, a squadron of Empire soldiers appeared in the sky. They descended with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their armored suits gleaming under the smoke-filled sky. There were at least 12 of them, all elite assassins, each one more skilled and deadly than any ordinary soldier. These were the ones sent to eliminate high-priority targets, Lyra and Ethan. Ethan's heart raced as he prepared for the fight of his life. His instincts kicked in, honed by years of war and survival. He could feel the adrenaline flooding his veins, his senses sharpening as he sized up the threat. He could take them down. He had to. "Get ready," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on his blaster. "We're not going down without a fight." Lyra didn't need any further instructions. Her shield pulsed with a renewed intensity as she stepped forward, her eyes glowing with determination. She raised her hand again, and the air around them seemed to hum with energy. But the Empire's soldiers weren't going to make this easy. The moment they landed, they began firing in coordinated bursts, their energy weapons lighting up the darkened jungle. Ethan dove to the side, narrowly avoiding a blast that would have incinerated him on the spot. He rolled behind a fallen tree, using it as cover as he returned fire. The blaster in his hand felt heavy but familiar. He could hear the steady rhythm of his own heart as he targeted one of the soldiers. With a sharp breath, he squeezed the trigger, sending a bolt of energy into the enemy's chest. The soldier collapsed, but there were more. Always more. Lyra's shield held strong against the barrage of fire, but it was weakening with every passing second. Ethan could see the cracks beginning to form, and in that moment, he knew they wouldn't have much longer. He had to do something. Anything. Suddenly, one of the elite soldiers darted to the side, attempting to flank them. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, using the cover of the jungle to mask his movement. He reached the soldier just as they were about to strike Lyra, and with a swift, deadly motion, he incapacitated them. But even as the soldier fell, more emerged from the shadows. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The shield was about to fail. The soldiers were closing in, and if they didn't find a way out, they were going to die. Ethan glanced back at Lyra, his eyes locked with hers. There was no more time for hesitation. He made his move, drawing the last of his strength and determination, pushing forward against the odds. "You ready?" He called out to her, his voice steadied despite the chaos. Lyra nodded, a fierce fire burning in her eyes. "Let's finish this." Together, they launched into the fray, their bond strengthening with every step, every move they made to survive the onslaught. But the question remained, would they make it out alive? The jungle was silent, eerily so. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood, the occasional crackling of flames in the distance marking the remnants of the brutal battle that had taken place. Ethan's chest was heaving, each breath a reminder of how close they had come to death. His body ached from the relentless fighting, the sting of old wounds mixing with fresh cuts and bruises. His mind, though, was focused on one thing: survival. But that survival didn't come without a cost. Lyra was beside him, her presence a mixture of power and vulnerability. The telekinetic shield she had conjured earlier had saved them, but it wasn't invincible. With every blast, every strike from the Empire's elite assassins, it had grown weaker. She had been pushing herself beyond her limits, tapping into her latent abilities, but even she could feel the toll it was taking on her. Her face was pale, beads of sweat trickling down her forehead, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that wasn't entirely human. She was ready. "How much longer can we hold them off?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. "I don't know," Lyra replied, her tone quiet but resolute. "I can feel them getting closer. They'll break through eventually." Ethan glanced around. They were cornered now, with the jungle closing in around them, and the assassin's footsteps echoing in the distance. There was no more room to retreat, no more places to hide. The endgame had arrived. And in that moment, Ethan knew what had to be done. "You need to leave," he said abruptly, turning to face her. Lyra blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "We fight together." Ethan shook his head, his expression hardening. "No, I can't let you risk it all. You're too important. You have a future, Lyra, a future that I won't let the Empire take from you." "But," she started to protest, but Ethan silenced her with a look. "The Empire is too strong. There's no way we can survive this together. But you can. You can escape. You can finish what we started. You can bring hope to your people, to everyone." Lyra opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She knew it was true. The sheer number of assassins coming for them made it impossible to survive. The Empire's reach was too vast, and even her powers, though formidable, couldn't take them all on. She had learned so much over the past few hours, how to control her abilities, how to unlock her true potential. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She could see it in Ethan's eyes. He had made up his mind. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's gaze softened, He could see the pain in her eyes, the fear of losing someone who had fought so hard for survival. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort in a moment where nothing could truly ease the pain. "You don't have a choice," he said quietly. "If you stay here, you won't survive. But if you leave, there's a chance to stop this madness." Lyra's chest tightened as she realized the truth of his words. Ethan was asking for the impossible, for her to let him go, for her to trust that she could finish what they had started alone. But she knew, deep down, that this was the only way for her people to have a future, the only way for the galaxy to have a chance at peace. "I can't lose you," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. She had never been one to cry. Her past had hardened her, made her a fighter. But Ethan had shown her something different. He had shown her that there was more to life than just surviving. He had given her hope. "You won't lose me," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "You're stronger than you know. And you'll always carry a piece of me with you." Before Lyra could say anything more, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The Empire's elite squad was closing in, and there was no more time. Ethan's hand tightened on his blaster, and for the first time in days, he felt at peace. He had made his choice, and in his heart, he knew it was the right one. "You have to go," he urged again, his voice more insistent now. Lyra hesitated, torn between her loyalty to him and the duty she now felt toward the people she was meant to save. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she finally nodded. "I won't forget this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, and I won't let your sacrifice be in vain." With one final, lingering look, she turned and sprinted toward the dense jungle, using her powers to move faster than the human eye could follow. Ethan watched her go, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. But in that moment, he knew he had done the right thing. The assassins emerged from the shadows, their eyes cold and calculating. They were here to finish what they had started. Ethan stood tall, a lone warrior facing a dozen enemies. His mind was clear, his heart steady. There was no fear in his chest, only determination. "Come on, then," he muttered under his breath, gripping his blaster tightly. "Let's finish this." The first assassin charged, weapon raised, but Ethan was ready. His training kicked in, and with a fluid motion, he ducked under the strike and fired. The shot hit its mark, the soldier crumpling to the ground in a heap. Ethan moved fast, using the jungle to his advantage as he picked off one assassin after another. But there were too many, and for every one he took down, two more seemed to take its place. As the battle raged on, Ethan could feel his strength waning. His wounds were taking their toll, and the energy from the fight was draining him. But he fought on, refusing to back down, refusing to let the Empire win. He had made his choice, and now he would see it through to the end. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a fight he could win. This was a fight he had to lose, so that she could win. With a final, desperate push, Ethan took down the last of the assassins, his body collapsing in exhaustion. He had done everything he could, and now it was up to Lyra to carry on the fight. As the darkness closed in around him, Ethan closed his eyes, a small smile on his lips. He had given everything for the future, and that, in the end, was enough. Somewhere in the distance, Lyra was still running, still fighting, and he knew with certainty that she would succeed. The galaxy would be safe. She would make sure of it, and his sacrifice would never be forgotten. The wind whispered through the dense trees of the jungle, carrying with it a faint memory of the battle that had just passed. The trees were scared, their leaves burned, but life was already beginning to reclaim what had been lost. Yet for Lyra, the world felt empty, even with the jungle around her. Ethan's sacrifice echoed in her mind, louder than any sound the forest could offer. Every step she took, every breath she drew, reminded her of the price of survival. Her powers, now fully awakened, hummed within her. She had learned to control them in a way that no one, not even her enemies, could have predicted. Her telekinetic abilities were sharper, more focused. Her ability to read the thoughts and emotions of those around her had grown stronger. Yet, as powerful as she was, she still felt the weight of Ethan's loss. He had given his life for her, and the mission they had started together still needed to be completed. Lyra moved with purpose, her steps quick but calculated, as she made her way toward a hidden base deep within the jungle. The old base, a relic from an earlier rebellion, was all that remained of the resistance against the Galactic Empire. It was here that Lyra had once hidden, before everything had changed. She had been a mere shadow of who she was now, a broken soul running from her past, from her destiny. But Ethan had shown her what she was truly capable of. He had believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. Now it was time to fulfill her promise to him, to finish what they had started. The jungle around her seemed to pulse with energy, as though it was alive and aware of her every move. The birds, the insects, even the wind itself seemed to recognize that something had changed. Lyra was no longer the frightened girl who had once been a slave. She was no longer the weapon that the Empire had created. She was something more. She was a leader. And it was time for her people to rise. Her thoughts wandered to the Zerath, her people, who were scattered across the galaxy, hidden away in the darkest corners of the Empire's territories. They had been enslaved, their minds and bodies twisted into weapons, until the Empire had no further use for them. But Lyra was different. She had broken free, and now she was determined to find the others, to unite them, and to lead them in a war against the very Empire that had enslaved them. Lyra's mind flickered back to the flashes of memories she had unlocked during her time with Ethan, the pain of her captivity, the endless experimentation, the cruel hands of the Empire that had torn her apart and remade her into something they could control. They had thought they could break her, but they had underestimated the strength of her spirit. And now, that same strength would be the key to her people's freedom. She arrived at the base, a derelict structure built into the side of a mountain, hidden by dense trees and thick vines. It had once been a beacon of hope for those who had dared to stand against the Empire, but now it was just a shell of its former self. The equipment was outdated, the walls covered in moss, but it was still standing. It had survived, just as she had. Inside, Lyra found a collection of old data files, relics from the past rebellion. She pulled up the information on her makeshift terminal, scanning through the files for any sign of her people. The information was old, outdated, but there was enough to track down some of the remaining Zerath across the galaxy. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she scrolled through the data, a map of the galaxy appeared on the screen, showing various planets where Zerath refugees had been hidden. Lyra studied it, her mind already calculating the best course of action. She couldn't waste any time. The Empire was still out there, hunting her, hunting them. But she knew she couldn't do this alone. She would need allies. She would need an army. Lyra's fingers hovered over the terminal for a moment, her thoughts racing. She could feel the weight of the mission ahead of her. The task was monumental. To unite the Zerath, to bring them together, would take time, patience, and sacrifice. But she had already lost so much, and she wasn't going to lose any more. She made a decision. It was time to reach out. Using the last of the communication equipment in the base, she sent out a message, a call to arms. It would go unnoticed by most, but there were those who would hear it. Rebel cells across the galaxy would hear it. Zerath refugees would hear it. And together, they would rise. The message was simple, but it carried a power that Lyra had never known before. I will not run anymore. This is my fight now. As the message sent, a feeling of peace washed over her. It wasn't the peace of a quiet victory. It wasn't the peace of a battle won. It was the peace of knowing that she had finally embraced her destiny. The fear that had once gripped her heart was gone, replaced by a burning determination. She was no longer the hunted. She was the hunter. She turned away from the terminal and looked out at the jungle. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. The day was ending, but for Lyra, a new beginning was on the horizon. She knew what she had to do. She knew what she was fighting for. And this time, she wouldn't stop until the Empire was defeated, until her people were free. Lyra set off, her steps steady, her resolve unshakable. There were challenges ahead, battles to fight, and enemies to face. But Lyra was no longer alone. She had a cause, and she had a team waiting to be assembled. As she walked into the twilight, the stars above seemed to twinkle brighter than ever before. The galaxy was vast, filled with dangers and darkness, but Lyra knew that she could bring light to it. She was no longer the girl who had been broken by the Empire. She was the warrior who would bring it down. And with that thought, she stepped into the night, ready to fight for the future of her people, ready to bring the rise of the Zerath. Her journey had just begun.